Well, good afternoon, brethren, and happy Sabbath to you all. And a big welcome also to everyone joining us here today on the webcast. Now, the Ten Commandments form the bedrock of law in the Torah and the rest of the Bible. Now, so far in this series I've been doing on the Ten Commandments, we have looked at the first three commandments. Now, today, in the next message of this series on the Ten Commandments, we're going to look at the fourth commandment, God's holy Sabbath. Now, the fourth commandment is given to us in verses 8 to 11 of Exodus 20, where God commands the following. Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. 6 days you shall labour and do all your work, but the seventh day is the Sabbath of the Lord your God. In it you shall do no work, you nor your son, nor your daughter, nor your male servant, nor your female servant, nor your cattle, nor your stranger who is within your gates. For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, the sea, and all that is in them, and rested the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and hallowed it. Now let's notice some key points in this commandment. Now we are told to remember it and to keep it holy, meaning pure or set apart for God. Now the word Sabbath or Shabbat in the Hebrew simply means a rest. Now Strong's Concordance also note that it means intermission, like having a break in a movie. Now this command plainly identifies the Sabbath rest as the seventh day, despite the fact that most mainstream Christian churches keep Sunday, the first day of the week, as their day of worship, a point that we'll come back to a little later and examine why. Now, we are commanded not to do any work on the Sabbath day, including people and animals that we have authority over. Now, we are then given a reason why we have this command from God that points back to the first chapters of Genesis. Now, God fashioned the sky and the earth and everything in it over 6 days in the week that he created mankind, and he then rested on the seventh day. Now, being God, obviously he didn't need to rest, but he did so and blessed and hallowed the seventh day each week as a sacred time set apart for his purpose. Now we have the original version that Moses received on Mount Sinai in Exodus 20, and we also have a second rendition of it that Moses reiterated to the Israelites in chapter 5 of Deuteronomy, which he spoke on the plains of Moab shortly before they crossed over to the Jordan River. Now in the second rendition, Moses, under inspiration of the Holy Spirit, paraphrases the original version and adapts it, giving additional information about this commandment. Now I've highlighted two differences. Now the first difference is the first word that is used. Now in Exodus 20 it says, remember the Sabbath. Now remember is translated from the Hebrew word zakar, meaning to mark or remember. Now in Deuteronomy 5 it says to observe or keep the Sabbath. Now the Hebrew word there is shamar, which means to guard, to protect, to keep. Now the other difference is the reason at the end that God gives for keeping the Sabbath holy. Now in Exodus 20 the Sabbath is described as a sign of God's creation, which emphasises that God is our creator. Now in Deuteronomy 5, after the command to observe the Sabbath and allow time of rest to servants, Moses continues that thought by reminding the people that they were formerly slaves themselves. Now the Sabbath is connected to God's redemption of Israel from Egypt, which is a type of God's redemption of us and the work that he is doing in freeing us from sin. So, the two themes of the Sabbath are remembering that God is our creator, and the second is remembering that God is redeeming us from sin. Now, remembering God's creation during the week he created mankind is one meaning of the Sabbath that reflects on the past. The other theme of God's redemption is both past and present. Now, he has saved us from our past sins, and he is working on us with us today, delivering us as we work to overcome our new sins. Now, there's also a future meaning in the Sabbath day that Paul spoke about in Hebrews 4. Now, the Sabbath on a weekly basis also pictures the millennium when God's kingdom will be brought to this earth and mankind will finally experience rest from war, poverty, and suffering. Now, Paul explains that the time after Jesus Christ returns and brings God's kingdom is likened to a rest in verse 1. Now, in verse 4, he draws on the analogy of the seven-day week, likening the time of God's kingdom to the Sabbath at the end of that week. Now, Herbert Armstrong, in his book, The Wonderful World Tomorrow, What It Will Be Like, wrote the following: God marked out 6 millennial days to allow man to indulge in a spiritual labour of sin, followed by a millennium of spiritual rest under the enforced government of God. End of quote. Now, we've had almost 6,000 years of man's rule, and we await the 1,000 years spoken of in Revelation 20 after Jesus Christ's second coming. Now, in verses 1 to 8, as well as the 2 verses after verse 9, Paul always uses the Greek word kataporsis for rest. However, he uses a different word, sabbatismos, in verse 9, where it is translated as rest. Now, in that verse, we read the following: there remains therefore a rest for the people of God. Now, most translations have hidden the true meaning of what Paul was trying to say here. The word sabbatismos in this verse literally means a keeping of the Sabbath or Sabbath keeping. Now, Scottish scholar Robert Young, in his Young's literal translation, renders verse 9 as, there doth remain then a sabbatic rest to the people of God. Now, as to related statutes in the Torah to the Sabbath command, we find listed in Leviticus 23 not just the weekly Sabbath, but annual Sabbaths, 7 festivals each year that, like the weekly Sabbath, have great meaning and teach us about God's plan of redemption for all of mankind. Now, in Leviticus 23 verses 1 and 2, we read, and the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, speak to the children of Israel and say to them, the feasts of the Lord, which you shall proclaim to be holy convocations. These are my feasts. Now, notice that God says here that these are the feasts of the Lord, not the feasts of the Jews, and he says that they are my feasts. Now, when God says that these are my feasts here in Leviticus 23, which includes the Sabbath, the Hebrew word for feast here is moed, or moedim in the plural. Now, the word moed means an appointment. So these are actually divine appointments that God has called us to at a specific time and place. Now, in addition to the national meaning of them for ancient Israel, there is another layer of Christian symbolism in each of these festivals. Now, this table here shows the Christian meaning of each of these festivals, which we'll start to begin to celebrate quite soon. Now, the first 3 relate to New Testament events, and the last 4 relate to end time events still to occur. Now, the prophetic nature of some of the feast days is touched on by the Apostle Paul in Colossians 2 verses 16 and 17, a verse that's often used to say that these days are not needed to be kept. Now, the Apostle Paul tells us that these observances are a shadow of things to come. In other words, they foreshadow things in the future. Now, we see that future symbolism in the Sabbath as well as the last 4 festivals. Now, Leviticus 23 verse 3, we read the following: 6 days you shall work be done, but the 7th day is a Sabbath of solemn rest, a holy convocation. You shall do no work on it. It is the Sabbath of the Lord in all your dwellings. Now, an intimate part of keeping the Sabbath is assembling for a holy convocation. Now, a convocation is a commanded assembly or gathering of people. Now, God commands our presence each Sabbath in the same way that a court can command our presence to be as a witness in a court case unless we have a genuine reason such as sickness or distance. Now, God has commanded it because he knows that we need regular encouragement and to regularly hear God's truth being taught to us to help us to stick close to him. Now in Hebrews 10 verses 24 and 25, Paul writes, "And let us consider one another in order to stir up love and good works, not forsaking the assembling of ourselves together, as is the manner of some, but exhorting one another, and so much more as you see the day approaching." Now it's wonderful that we have the technology to webcast and to connect remotely, but that should never be a substitute for coming together in person when we're able to. Now there is power in presence and being able to practice serving in our local churches. Now at church we can be with fellow members, face to face, and listen to them, give them support and friendship, and even give them a hug if they need one. Now the Holy Convocation, where we come together each week, is a vital part of the purpose of the Sabbath. Now we also read in Exodus 31 verse 13 that the Sabbath was also given as a sign to identify who are the people of God because of how it tests our faith. Now many people over the years have stood up for the Sabbath, willing to leave jobs which have required them to work on the Sabbath. Now most of mainstream Christianity keeps Sunday as the Christian day of worship. Now did this practice come from the Bible or not? Now notice this frank quote from a Catholic priest by the name of Cardinal Gibbon. He writes, "Now the scriptures alone do not contain all the truths which a Christian is bound to believe, nor do they explicitly enjoin all the duties which he is obliged to practice. Not to mention other examples. Is not every Christian obliged to sanctify Sunday and to abstain on that day from all unnecessary servile work? Is not the observance of this law among the most prominent of our sacred duties? But you may read the Bible from Genesis to Revelation, and you will not find a single line authorising the sanctification of Sunday. The scriptures enforce the religious observance of Saturday, a day which we never satisfy." End of quote. Now in another publication, the Catholic Mirror, he also plainly stated, "The Catholic Church, by virtue of her divine mission, changed the day from Saturday to Sunday." Now the Catholic Church believes it had the authority to change the day of worship from the Sabbath to Sunday based on Matthew 16 verse 19, where Christ said to Peter, "And I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven, and whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven." Now they feel that the popes, who in their view are the successors to Peter, had the authority to change one of the 10 Commandments based on this binding and loosening principle. Now such binding and loosing power was previously given to Israel's kings and its judges. However, any new laws they made had to be consistent with the existing laws of the Torah, much like new laws of our land cannot violate our constitution. Now, Catholic Monsignor Louise Segur also wrote the following: "The observance of Sunday by Protestants is a homage that they pay," talking about the Protestants, "in spite of themselves to the authority of the Catholic Church." Now, Protestant churches attempt to use the scriptures to justify Sunday, keeping based on a handful of vague references, which the Catholic Church is honest enough not to do. Now, here are a few references to show that Jesus Christ and the apostles kept the Sabbath as their custom was. Now, historian Jesse Hurlbut, in his book, The Story of the Catholic Church, writes, "As long as the church was mainly Jewish, the Hebrew Sabbath was kept. But as it became increasingly Gentile, the first day gradually took the place of the seventh day. End of quote. Now notice that it happened gradually. It wasn't by any command of Jesus Christ that the change took place. And it should be noted that all the apostles were Jewish. Now William Durant also writes, the serious temper of the Jewish Sabbath was transferred to the Christian Sunday that replaced it in the 2nd century. End of quote. Now the change took place after the death of Jesus and the apostles, not by their command. Now the move towards adopting Sunday by the early visible church was motivated by two things. The first was to distance themselves from the Jews. Now following the Jewish revolts around 70 and 135 AD, strong anti-Jewish sentiment and persecution swept throughout the Roman Empire. And Jews basically became the pariahs of the Roman Empire. Now today we see great pressure on our Western world to adopt woke ideology, including accepting homosexuality as a valid lifestyle. Now so many mainstream Christian churches today are yielding to that pressure and are going woke. Now around 1800 years ago there was similar pressure on the visible church to not appear Jewish. And most of them yielded to that pressure, rejecting the Sabbath and the festivals in the Torah. Now the other thing that motivated their adoption of Sunday by the Catholic Church was to increase their numbers by mixing Christian beliefs with pagan practices, such as worshipping on the venerable day of the sun, as Constantine referred to Sunday as. Now the change was justified by emphasising that Sunday was the true Lord's Day, being the day that they taught that Christ was resurrected on. Now this became law in the Roman Empire in 365 AD, with the power of the state to punish those who kept the Sabbath. Now there are two great purposes of the Sabbath. Now one purpose of the Sabbath is the blessing of time off from our work for physical rejuvenation. Now the other purpose of this day of rest is that it gives us time for spiritual rejuvenation. Now our United Church of God booklet, the 10 Commandments, says the following about the Sabbath. Relationships take time. Every successful association demands time. No close relationship can succeed without it. No courtship, no marriage, no friendship. Our relationship with God is no exception. The Sabbath is a special day to concentrate on developing our spiritual relationship with God. Although it is a day of rest from our normal routines, and we do need even physical rejuvenation, it is not a day of doing nothing, as some assumed. On the contrary, the Sabbath is a special day on which we dramatically change the focus of our activity. God intended that it be a delightful period during which we busily draw closer to God. End of quote. Now in Isaiah 58 verses 13 and 14, we read the following principles on how to keep the Sabbath holy. If you turn away your foot from the Sabbath, from doing your pleasure on my holy day, and call the Sabbath a delight, the holy day of the Lord honourable, and shall honour him by not doing your ways, nor finding your pleasure, nor speaking your own words, then you shall delight yourself in the Lord. Now notice that the emphasis is on God. There are three categories of things that we are to strive to avoid on the Sabbath. 1, doing our own ways. 2, finding our own pleasure. And 3, speaking with our own words. Now our own ways has to do with our employment and those things involved in helping us to make a living. Now finding our own pleasure involves our hobbies, sports and other personal interests, while our words means the everyday things that we talk about that don't involve God. Now God wants us to delight in the Sabbath. Now we shouldn't focus on the things that we can't do, but on the things that we can do on the Sabbath, which allows us more time to think about God, to pray and to study the Bible, and to learn more about his awesome purpose. So in summary, the fourth commandment, the Sabbath, is a weekly appointment that God has commanded for our good, so we have regular focused time to build our relationship with him. The Sabbath command to rest on the seventh day of the week has two objectives. One is physical rejuvenation, and the other is spiritual rejuvenation, for which there includes a commanded assembly each week to learn more about God, his word and way of life, and to fellowship with others of like mind, giving and receiving spiritual support from one another. Now, it has two great themes of remembering God as our creator, being a memorial of the Sabbath after which he created mankind, and also God as our redeemer from the bondage of sin. A third meaning is that it also looks forward to the millennium, the seventh millennial day of God's plan for mankind, when Christ will rule the earth, and there will be peace and spiritual rest from the corruption of this present age of man. Thank you.